The Canby Report was produced and recorded on the traditional and unceded lands of the Anishinaabe, Algonquin, and Coquitlam peoples. It's May 5th, 2025, and there are 530 days left until the Vancouver municipal elections. This is the Canby Report. I'm Matthew Naylor.
I'm Ian Bushfield, coming off a by-election hangover.
Yes.
That's what it was.
It was definitely that, and not that lives got really, really busy.
Time just keeps happening.
You know what? Everyone, the important journalism had provided you with the information in advance. After the election, there was no election to inform you about, other than the election that had just happened, but that one had been fixed. Like, you know, it had transpired and been observed and was now in a solid state, and so it was going to remain a solid state for another month. So here we are at last. Thank you for your patience.
In fact, a federal election happened in the meantime as well.
Yeah, what a time we live in. But if you want to continue getting the Canby Report and support citizen journalism in Greater Vancouver, please join us at patreon.com/Canby Report.
Yes, patreon.com/Canby Report, because we're not always producing episodes. We are always having fascinating discussions in our exclusive Slack channel. Go support the show and join those conversations, even if we don't always have an episode. We will do more episodes more frequently going forward.
Yes, patreon.com/Canby Report. Obviously, we're going to get to the by-election, but we wanted to begin with the horrific tragedy that has rocked Vancouver at the Lapu Lapu Day Festival, in which 11 people were killed when a vehicle rammed into the festival in the closing moments.
Absolutely tragic, and we're still reeling as a city. We'll put the link in the show notes to the Filipino BC Kapwa Strong fundraiser that they have set up with the United Way if you want to support the victims' families and the community there as they help and work to try to come whole again. It's really hard to go through that. It's still very early days to know what happened. We have seen some reporting on the suspect who was apprehended by festival goers. They managed to stop and hold him until police were able to arrest him. It seems like there were mental health conditions, and not in the way that kind of every one of these attackers is said, oh, there's probably just mental health issues, unless they're brown.
This is a thing that we do as a society. Like, going and setting out to kill people or intending to kill is not a normal state of affairs for most people. And so, obviously, there is some divergence from the mean that is happening inside this person's head. The first question that comes to mind is, how could this happen? There is a time for mourning that has to be observed, but questions have to be asked about why this was even possible.
This is a politics podcast, and there is politics involved in this, both in terms of the supports that did or did not exist to help this person or prevent them from taking this on. Those questions will be asked through the criminal trial and possibly through inquiries after that, and questions around the festival organizing and the security, maybe not necessarily of the organizers, but also of the city and the police who are engaged in helping community organizers. A group of volunteers who decide to put on a street festival is a really good thing, but they don't know how to do risk assessment in most cases. They need to rely on the city and the police to help them. It's clear that something failed here. We're not going to stop every tragedy in every case,
but we do need
but
to
stopping a car from driving down a street should be reasonable.
Yeah, we need to understand why this happened, how it was possible for it to happen. Festivals are one of the highlights of Vancouver in all seasons. The presence of people out on the street is always going to be vulnerable to becoming a target. There are ways that the police other festival organizers and the city have been able to create a safe atmosphere and a safe site for these things. And yet also there have been failures in the past. I mean, 2011 saw a huge riot downtown. That's not the same type of event, but they're both very negative and intersect with how police and planning control large groups of people.
Yeah, and I think the other issue we're both passionate about is making sure that as these issues are reviewed, we continue to be able to fund festivals that are not so prohibitive in terms of the security and requirements for organizers, and that also still respect the civil liberties and human rights of people. To not have a festival where every 5 meters there's heavily armed police officers intimidating the crowd.
Yeah, no one wants
There's a
well-based.
balance, right? Yeah. So lots of discussions to continue through there. We'll keep an eye on that. But let's turn our eye to another failure.
The election was run really badly. This is the top story of the whole thing. Big landslide win for the two people who won. But this election was a giant catastrophe, and the city was totally unprepared for the amount of people and wasted like years off of the lives of people by just forcing everyone to wait in line.
It looked like it was going to be a wild turnout election, like super motivated, because people were standing in line for 2 to 3 hours by reports on the day. Even advance voting was pretty significant. And so everyone was like, wow, there's going to be massive turnout. And it was 15%, barely more than the 2017 by-election, where Hector Bremner won with 11% turnout.
Now, there are some other differences between that election and this election, notably the amount of money that was spent on it, which went up, and the amount of people and polling stations that were available for people to vote at, which went down substantially.
No one really paid attention about 18 months ago when city staff brought forward a recommendation for how to run by-elections, and it included some drastic changes. They predicted there would be a big shift towards mail-in ballots. And so they're like, we don't need as many polling stations. We don't need as many people working the polling stations. We have the vote tabulators now, and they work pretty well. We've seen them successfully used at provincial and municipal elections. And that just requires fewer people on the ground. And post-pandemic, people will use mail-in ballots. So we'll put a big effort into that. I don't know where the money went in the end, because there wasn't a big vote-by-mail campaign, as far as I could tell, or anyone reported seeing. Instead, people went, as they usually do in a non-lockdown election, to the polls on election day, but there weren't many polls, and there weren't many people helping them get in. The tabulators worked, but they still take a little bit of understanding, and issues can arise, so people were suddenly waiting hours in line. Thankfully, there were shortcuts for people with disabilities or who had other genuine reasons to not be in line for 2 hours, but not everyone was informed of that. I know there were staff trying to help, but wow.
But not as many staff. And notably, the number of workers in the field in this election declined from the 2017 number of 631 to 265, which is a cut of more than half. Similarly, the number of polling stations was reduced from 2017 from 50 to 25 in this election. No wonder there were issues. You're either going to be doubling the volume at any given place and then expecting the same number of staff to deal with it, or perhaps this was well-intentioned but ultimately wrong thinking, that people are going to continue to behave like they did in COVID after COVID. Wasn't going to be the case, but mail-in ballot didn't really turn out the way that they thought.
Yeah, it was a failing on the staff side. It was a failing on council because they did okay this plan. Now, they have to rely a little bit on staff's expertise and advice, but there is a push and pull at council. Like when staff says, hey, we're going to cut staff by 62% at polls, that merits a good questioning, at least.
To Peter Meisner's credit, he and he alone raised this as an issue, saying, quote, "Why are we doing this? It seems like we're making it more difficult," end quote.
Not wrong.
Not wrong at all. Thank you, Peter, for being the Cassandra of this particular election. But we have discussed the state of the track and the shoes on the horses enough. Now perhaps we can move on to the results, which are Sean Orr and Lucy Maloney.
Yes, Cope and One City blew it out of the water. Both got effectively double the runner-up, Colleen Hardwick, and Annette Riley of the Greens at only 15,000. They both got over 33,000 votes. It was very close in terms of how people voted. There were basically 3 blocks of voters: Maloney, Hardwick Abbott, the team voters, and Steinkeisers, the ABC voters. Beyond that, a few people voted Maloney and Green, a few people voted Cope and Green, and then it's negligible who voted for the other ballot combinations.
The amount of people voting for the various combinations, folks, is actually quite interesting. We have this bit of information from Vancouver Open Data, and it shows the decline of people in any given subsequent bucket. A non-insignificant amount of people voting for either Sean or Lucy Maloney on their own without voting for anyone else. I believe that's plumping the ballot.
Yeah.
Some folks also voting for Jamie Stein. The people who apparently voting for Ralph Kaisers alone did not show up on the graph.
On the overall results, it's quite notable that Stein and Kaisers both got under 10,000 votes. They came in 5th and 6th. They were last among the people who had a party name on their ballot. So ABC ate shit.
Yeah,
in this election.
Like, this is a truly terrible result for them. Whether or not they decide to take any of this information to heart and change how they're behaving, or what their policies are, or how they're governing the city, or change the kind of fractious way that their own party administers itself, is anyone's guess. My guess is no, they won't, and then they're going to be defeated in the next election. The vibes are bad right now.
Yep. Team coming runner-up is also pretty interesting. Colleen Hardwick had quite a bit of name recognition, and she did significantly better than her teammate, Theodore Abbott, who got 6,000 less votes than she did, with Green and Annette Riley coming in between them. It was a very clear-cut election. I know I've spoken to the candidates, and they were like, we didn't know what it would be like on election night, and then it became very clear very quickly.
In terms of how people voted around the city, it's basically what you'd expect. Of the top 3 vote getters, Maloney, Orr, and Hardwick, Orr beats Maloney basically everywhere except for Kerrisdale, it looks like.
Mount Pleasant area. Not Creekside Mount Pleasant, but like City Hall and Douglas Park.
Yeah, at City Hall, you're right. But
only just.
But only just. Otherwise, Orr beats her pretty much everywhere, but by a small amount. Hardwick runs up her biggest totals in West Point, Kitsilano, Kerrisdale, Dunbar, everywhere you'd expect. The 3 were running closest in Dunbar, of all places, it looks like.
Yeah.
Low voter turnout in Dunbar, it looks like, though.
Yeah. Hastings and Enya, like East Van, and Trout Lake was like 75% Orr, just wild amounts. And Maloney was pretty high up there, too. Like, people showed up in those polls to bring Cope back. It's really understated how good Cope's campaign was this election after they had kind of evaporated from the political scene for so many years.
Yeah, and that's to their credit. They recruited a candidate who had run previously, had some name recognition, but was able to leverage that together with the Cope brand and the Cope volunteer base into a pretty resounding win.
Yeah, they had clear, effective messaging. They had radio ads that I heard, which I don't think Cope has had in like 20 years. And I'm not saying radio ads are an effective tool necessarily, but it does show that they have had some money to spend, which they probably haven't had in a while. And clearly some momentum. One City ran a pretty good campaign as well, getting their message out. And between them, I think we have a clear direction for where the progressive coalition will be in 2026. It's really interesting as well because VDLC, the unions, didn't endorse Sean Orr. They endorsed Annette Riley.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. Will the Greens be willing to throw in with one city and cope if they're expected to be a junior partner in the three-way coalition.
Yeah, I think the Greens have a pretty strong case for Pete Fry because he's an incumbent. But beyond that, they haven't shown the organizational capacity to keep up anymore. And we'll get into some of the annual report information, which I think it makes it even more clear-cut soon. The donors and the voters are behind. Maybe this was just kind of the by-election. Like, we don't want to over-analyze this. By-elections are a nice way to send a message without necessarily predicting what will happen in a general election. Governing parties usually do poorly in by-elections.
With respect to the actual outcome of this, Mayor Sim has indicated that he's going to reflect on resident satisfaction following this, his candidates getting absolutely obliterated.
Yeah, it's very funny that he went from, in January, having only Pete Fry in opposition to Pete Fry and Rebecca Bly, and now Pete Fry, Rebecca Bly, Lucy Maloney, and Sean Orr, each bringing a slightly different voice to criticize his party. And it wouldn't take much more for him to lose a majority at this rate.
No, and that's an interesting prospect. This isn't a startup. No one's making money off this beyond their counselor
Just Bitcoin.
Yeah, jeez. But like, you know, they have a job that like, the expression and representation is the job. It's not like in service of, you know, making a business go forward. There's research on how and why elected officials shouldn't view governments as the same as businesses, because it leads to pretty bad and kind of perverse outcomes. 2 seats away from losing the majority his team has on council, that would be, I think, embarrassing.
So, yeah, very interesting election. The last thing I want to bring up on the by-election itself, we talked about how Stephen Carter ran the ABC campaign. I don't feel the need to criticize him personally, but I think they've made a lot of bad choices in this campaign. He's reflected on that on his own podcast and in his media, saying, we got our butts handed to us. The decisions he's talked about on The Strategist, apparently, they didn't door knock for ABC because they thought it would be too hard to do in this city.
What?
Instead, they ran a campaign where they tried to do 200 kitchen table meetings in 50 days.
Door knocking is the easiest for ABC because most of their voters are the ones that live in single-family houses. What is he talking about? Many of them may have just not noticed that. Dear Lord, that was not a good call. That was a bad call. I don't think that they really had a chance of winning, but like this was a anticipated bad result that turned out even worse than I think anyone could have predicted for ABC.
Yeah, I think ABC could have pulled harder or made different choices that made them competitive with team. Maybe even kept the 3rd and 4th place, or maybe 4th and 5th if the Greens still edged them out. But like, they ceded ground to team. They didn't have a clear message other than, do you think the city hall is running great? And the answer people have been saying is no, based on all of the stories we've covered, particularly right up to the election and the scandals. It was Stephen Carter's idea to kick Rebecca Bly out of caucus, and they doubled down on the worst decisions.
And it's not like
in a campaign that wasn't, yeah.
It's not a fantastic situation where if someone asked me what's the best thing that ABC did over the last couple of years, my answer is probably raise taxes. That doesn't belong on a button. It's not a happy place on a button. Even though the taxes did need to be raised, and I'm glad they did it, but like, everything else just uninterrupted.
Well, and you can bring it back to the Lapu Lapu tragedy, where Ken Sim right after is like, we need more investment in mental health support. And some people turn it right around and say, didn't you promise to hire 100 mental health nurses to go with your 100 cops?
Yeah, like...
And like, sure, yes, the province has a role to fill in doing more for mental health, but like, you said you would, and then you just didn't. They did hire some, to their credit, and they did put some money to that.
This is
what they'd promised.
The inherent danger in promising something you don't have direct control over, Because if you promise something you don't have direct control over, and then something happens, the thing you had promised had been fulfilled, even though that isn't really in your control, then you're going to get blamed for it because you don't have follow through. That's the nature of this.
That's the by-election. We'll do more on that. I might try to get some more interviews. I'll see how my capacity is, but there's some interesting conversations I would love to have around how that campaign went and where things go from here. Let's turn our eyes back even further, because right after the by-election, I was very frustrated this came out 2 days after the by-election rather than the week before. It's very interesting data. The annual reports of the elector organizations of British Columbia for 2024. How much money did all these parties have last year? It would have been really informative to show us some of the individual parties' strength. I did a review of this on our blog last year, and I've already written this up for CambieReport.ca, so this is a charts on the podcast type situations. Go to the link in our show notes, find it on our website to look at these charts. At the top level, ABC raised a lot of money in 2024. Not surprising.
Truly, $500,000. $500,000, and I believe more than everyone else combined.
Yeah, in the city of Vancouver.
Yeah.
All the parties actually raised slightly less in 2024, I believe, than in 2023. Still a lot of money for an election year. $500,000 for ABC, $138,000 for one city, $70,000 for both Team and Cope, and $42,000 for the Greens. And
not
three parties don't exist anymore.
None of those numbers are terrible, and certainly we're not going into an election anytime I mean, it is actually coming up, but it's not urgent. They are going to have to step it up. ABC is always going to have a funding advantage just based on how society works and who their voters are. In order to compete with that, they need to make sure their volunteer system is solid. One City and Cope, I think, do have that organizational heft. Team is interesting because Team, I think, has been using different avenues of reaching people and been quite effective at it. Are still going to need more than that $70,000 in order to meaningfully fight the next election.
I do want to note that it's very funny that Vision Vancouver raised $67.66 in 2024.
Yes, lost $16,000.
They had the worst performance. They had a lot of expenses. ABC also had an absurd amount of expenses. For that $502,000 they raised, they only posted a net profit of the year of $50,000, which was almost met by One City, whose fundraising and organizational capacity is much more efficient than what has become ABC. They believe they spent a lot of money on contractors at ABC.
Oof.
And possibly also legal advice.
Lawyers can get expenses. So try and avoid doing crimes or violating the law. If you are a political party, it will save you in the long run, as you will probably get hauled before the courts less often than if...
We are still waiting to find out if ABC violated the 2022 election financing rules, as all of the opposition has complained.
Yeah, and obviously stay tuned for that, because that will be of interest here at the Cambie Report. Also interesting, the number of donors to parties in 2024 for ABC, it's not huge. It's about 600, 650-ish. Roughly the same for One City, with slightly more low-dollar donors. About half as many as ABC or One City. Cope has a huge donor list, but we don't know who any of them are because almost half of them donated anonymously, i.e. they were under the limit.
$50.
Yeah.
ABC and One City both had about 640 donors. Cope had 470 named donors, reported ones, and 532 anonymous. So they passed the hat a lot at events. Those anonymous donors have to be ones where people's name isn't given and it's literally just passing the hat for anything under $50. I do think it is an issue that Cope had so many anonymous donors. It clearly worked for them, but I think the way legislation is designed is that you'll get a few of those donations, but once you start getting this many, I could see a situation where someone gives $50 at each of your events in a pass the hat situation, and then That's not the party's fault for not collecting that data, but it could be a way of violating the elections law. And I'm not accusing Cope of doing this, but this does suggest an issue for me, possibly.
The question I have is the incentives aren't set up for people to do that. There is actually a benefit to giving your name. I do think that maybe they want to just provide people with an opportunity to put their name on the church, basically.
Cope clearly had the information it needed to get its voters out.
Yeah,
what's
this
also
is a stunning victory
yeah.
for them. Like, truly, it cannot be underscored enough what a huge victory this is for Cope.
The other interesting thing is when you look at the balance statements for each of the parties, how much cash did they have effectively, how much assets over their liabilities at the end of 2024. One city was the leader, $123,000. ABC just under $100,000. Cope and Team around $60,000. And Vote Socialist and Vision both in debt.
Yeah. So for the most part, the five big parties, not ready to fight an election today, but they're not in terrible shape.
Yeah. And you have to remember most of these parties probably spent a bunch of money on this by-election as well. They probably also raised a lot. So I'll be very curious to see the by-election reports, financial reports, when those come out that specifically detail how much they raised and spent in it. I suspect it will mirror this quite a bit. ABC, one city, and Cope raising quite a bit, spending quite a bit. Team probably raising quite a bit from the fewer wealthy donors it has. And the Greens may just disappear in it. Greens actually performed better in 2024 than the by-election would have predicted. I remember 2023 Greens had a pretty weak performance as well. But they're still not gone in the way the NPA is.
The NPA, they're gone.
Remember how the NPA won more elections than any political party in Canada?
The NPA, the Hudson Bay, eventually all things come to an end. What are you going to do?
Yeah. I also looked outside the city of Vancouver. One thing I found fascinating was Township of Langley Mayor Eric Woodward's party contract for Langley raised $274,000 in 2024. That's more than most parties in the city of Vancouver, except ABC. And they pocketed almost all of it because they had no expenses. So they're wealthy for the population they have to compete for. Yeah. Good luck anyone wanting to challenge Eric for mayorship.
What an interesting time. Similarly, Surrey Connect, i.e. Brenda Luck's party, raised $73,000, double her nearest competitor. In New Westminster, the New Westminster Progressives raised $53,000, almost $20,000 more than Patrick Johnstone's Community First.
The Progressives in New Westminster is the right-wing party, and the Community First is the left-wing, roughly.
Of course they're. It's never quite what you think.
Community First did have slightly more donors, so the Progressive relied on fewer wealthier donors. Overall, contract with Langley and Surrey Connect have a ton of cash in the bank. So money is on Eric Woodward and Brenda Locke running very effective campaigns in the next election. Money's not everything in these elections, as we've seen in the past, but no, it does help.
Certainly in Langley, you could just raise a bunch of money and then get elected without spending any of it. So good for Langley and Mayor Eric Woodward down there. One thing that I have noticed is that there's been this crop of VPD stories that have been bubbling up. Some of these may be the first shoots of some interesting questions or lines of inquiry that we might be looking into, including an allegation that in Task Force Barrage, what a way to call an operation to basically attack the downtown east side. The Barrage apparently has arrest quotas associated with it, so alleges a anonymous officer to a meeting of the police board.
Yeah, a bunch of people noticed that a Vancouver Police Board agenda a couple of weeks ago included as a discussion item this whistleblower allegation, this letter to the board saying, I'm a current duty cop and we have been told to blank arrest blank people. There's a lot of parts redacted, and it kind of challenged that the barrage was more politically motivated than public safety motivated.
Yes,
seems
of course
believable to me.
It's like that's what we've been saying.
Police Chief Adam Palmer, who is on his way out to greener pastures at the RCMP as Assistant Commissioner, he's denied these allegations. He says he doesn't even know if this is a real cop, and they have no quotas.
Nevertheless, the VPD have apparently just blown through their budget over the year in spite of getting a fairly substantial budget increase. Basically, they're 2.9% over in salaries and benefits, 3.7% over overall. It's projected to finish the year 1.6% over budget, or about $7 million.
Oh, well.
Oh, well, I guess we...
What you gonna do?
Yeah, apparently the city can cut that budget. That's impossible. And illegal. Dear Lord.
Notably, $5 million of that deficit is associated with Task Force Barrage specifically, and this has led some to question,
why did we
what's
do
the
this?
Accountability here?
Yeah, what is this, and why did it cost so much, and why has it generated these complaints? $5 million just for a crackdown in crime that I don't think has been particularly helpful. I feel like more questions must be asked. What happened? Why is it so expensive? One thing we do know what happened to it is the McBarge, because, of course, we end every episode of the Cambie Report with a little tidbit from Vancouver's history, a Vancouverata, the McBarge, a McDonald's during Expo 86, an event I have no memory of because I was not alive yet and also grew up in Calgary.
I was an infant at the time,
Well,
also in Calgary-ish.
This barge, there were, basically during the expo, it sat near Science World serving as a McDonald's. And then afterwards, in spite of many different plans for what could be done with it, it sat moored in the Fraser River until about a month ago, where it capsized and sank.
Yeah. Not exactly clear what sunk the vessel.
Water. I am helpful.
Among the more ambitious ideas was in 2017, the owner proposing a deep ocean discovery center for the barge, including vintage diving tech and interactive exhibits. That would have been kind of cool. Some wanted to make it a pub, which a transition from a McDonald's to a bar or a restaurant seems pretty easy. Nothing took, though.
No, and, 30 years of wear and tear. Like, every time someone checked in on this barge to see if something could be done with it, there was an assessment of how much it would cost. It always came in way higher, and it basically meant that this thing was not usable because it hadn't been used, which is a shame.
Yeah. It was the inevitable end to this vessel.
Yeah.
Similarly, the ferry caught fire in the Fraser River outside Mission this past weekend in possibly suspicious circumstances, and to which Mission Search and Rescue's response upon finding it was, water's probably not going to put that out, so let her burn.
Yeah, and truly, there are some spectacular photographs of just going up in that conflagration. I encourage you to check them out. They look like Renaissance painting crossing the river Styx on its way to hell. Thanks all for listening. This has been another edition of the Cambie Report. I'm Matthew Naylor for Leg and Boot Media.
I'm Ian Bushfield.
Good night.